Hi and welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Welcome to Private Funds Industry Replay. Thank you to the Intertrust Group for hosting us all today. We're going to look at a really relevant and timely topic, the EU ESG taxonomy, the promise of a common language. Obviously, the industry as a whole is sitting on top of a confluence of trends within the ESG space. We have the regulation changes that we're talking about today. We have the interest of key stakeholders within management firms who are lobbying for change, who realise the importance of change. And then lastly, we have the investors, we have the LPs who are keen to have clearer reporting lines, keen to understand how their money is being put to work and how effective their money is when it comes to leveraging change as well. So a hugely important topic for the space. With me today to address some of these key points, we have Peter Dunbar from the UNPRI, Carmela Mondino from Partners Group, and Antonello Argenziano from the Intertrust Group. Before we delve a bit deeper, I'm going to ask all three of them to introduce themselves quickly. So Peter, over to you if you want to say a few words about your experience and a little bit about the UNPRI. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Gwyn. Thanks for moderating, and thanks to Intertrust for having me and the PRI. As you said, I'm Peter Dunbar. I'm the PRI's head of private equity. I've worked for PRI for 2 years now, and before that I worked for Capital Group, which is a kind of big public markets asset manager, mostly, but in their private equity group.
Thank you, Peter. And Carmela.
Hello, thank you for having me. My name is Carmela Mondino. I'm head of ESG and sustainability here at Partners Group. I've been with the firm for 5 years, and I'm responsible for the team that works with our portfolio on sustainability topics. And before joining Partners Group, I was actually working as an engineer in the oil and gas industry, so very technical and different background. But happy to be here and share what I've been doing in the last 5 years.
Thank you, Carmela. And Antonello.
Thanks, Gwyn, and hello, everybody. Antonello Argenziano. So I'm product director at Intertrust Group, where I look at the development of our products and services for our clients. And I'm very happy to be here today.
Thank you. And starting with you, Antonello, actually, I wonder if you can just take us from the top, really, and give us a brief intro to the current state of play of the taxonomy regulation. What is it trying to achieve? What are the current objectives? And does it really facilitate investment in sustainable economic activities?
Sure, happy to cover that. So taxonomy, I would say, is a quite ambitious and technical piece of regulation. It comes from one of the actions of the European Action Plan on Sustainable Finance, which has a main objective to redirect capital toward more sustainable investments. Now, with the European Green Deal, the European Commission has restated the ambition to become carbon neutral, so that Europe becomes carbon neutral by 2050, and reduction of carbon emission by 55% by 2030. So again, those are as well very ambitious objectives. And to do that, the Commission estimates that 1 trillion euro, so 1 trillion, will have to be mobilized within this decade to facilitate that transition. So that means that a lot of investments will have to flow toward economic sustainable activities. But until the implementation of taxonomy, there was no clear agreed definition of what makes an economic activity sustainable. So this is really where taxonomy comes into play, providing a science-based dictionary to define or to classify an economic activity as sustainable. Now, also consider that the taxonomy regulation has 6 objectives. So those are climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, water and marine resources, circular economy, pollution prevention, and biodiversity. Now, to assess the alignment of an economic activity to those objectives set by the regulation, there are technical screening criteria that are being developed. But I would say if we look at it in a really nutshell, we can say that an economic activity is an activity that provides a positive contribution to one of the objectives set by the directive without harming any of the other 5. So that is the concept of do not significant harm. At the same time, an activity to be considered taxonomy aligned needs to respect some minimal social safeguards. So those are the OECD guidelines or as well the UN guiding principle on business and human rights. Maybe to give a practical example of a taxonomy aligned activity, we can look at one company that is respecting human rights, that is respecting labor law, and is developing a new technology for the reduction of carbon emission. Well, if that new technology has a positive impact and on the other side does not, for example, have any negative impact on biodiversity, then in that case we can consider that that activity is in scope of taxonomy and is a taxonomy aligned activity. Maybe to be even more concrete, an automotive company that is now investing in electric engine, if meets those conditions, then will be considered as investing into or developing an economically sustainable activity.
Great, thank you. And really quickly before we move to Peter, I mean, in terms of the new shifting landscape, that's propelling SFDR and CSRD forward. I mean, what are the immediate changes and the immediate impact of all of that?
Yeah, so taxonomy, SFDR, CSRD are all very closely linked to each other. Now consider that beside the science-based dictionary that we have just mentioned, taxonomy also introduces new reporting requirements for companies that are already in scope of CSRD and the non-financial reporting directive. Now we know that the non-financial reporting directive will be replaced by CSRD, and with that movement, with that change, we will see that the scope of CSR company in scope will increase. At the moment, with the non-financial reporting directive, we have about 12,000 companies in Europe. Those are mostly larger listed corporations, and with the CSRD, there'll be over 50,000 in Europe. So the scope of companies will increase largely, and also the set of KPIs that will have to be reported from an environmental perspective will increase. So that means that more and more companies will have to report on their taxonomy alignment. On the other side, if we look at SFDR, we know that Article 8 and Article 9 funds will have to report as part of their periodic reporting document, which will go live on the 1st of January 2023, on the taxonomy alignment of their investments. So you really see that the three regulations are closely linked to each other. And I'll also say that, of course, all of this is creating a huge movement of data and a big requirement of having new ESG data reporting. And for that, technology is going to be a key enabler. We have at Antitrust Group have conducted a survey recently where we have interviewed over 300 CFOs of private capital firms, and the consensus is that technology is going to be a key enabler to meet those regulatory requirements. In particular, many of them are looking at new technologies or specific software developed to gather data from underlying portfolio companies, consolidate that data, normalize that data, consolidate it at the fund level, and then use that information for reporting purposes. So that's really the challenge that I think is keeping many busy at the moment.
Great, thank you for that overview. And just drilling down a bit into the issues, Peter, from your perspective at the UNPRI, I mean, what are the immediate current challenges around ESG? You know, what's in, what's out? And we were talking about the example of nuclear and natural gas, for example.
Yeah, sure. I guess just before we get to that kind of situation today, maybe if we just back up a little bit, and I think the first thing to say though, before I get on some of the problems, is that actually last year when we looked at the PRI reporting, the data we get from our signatories, nearly 400 of those PRI signatories already do use the EU Sustainable Taxonomy in some way to measure sustainability outcomes. So, I do think that does show the potential it has to drive investment decision making and flows into those kind of economic activities that are sustainable. But then, and I guess the but there is that the rollout by the EU of the SFDR and the kind of taxonomy regulation has been suboptimal, shall we say. There have been long-standing issues that have become known as known unknowns. So, for example, whether certain Article 8 funds actually do need to report through the taxonomy or not, or whether they can report simply 0%, for example. There's been a lot of confusion there. I think along with the delays, everyone's heard about the delays that have happened as well. It's led to a lot of consternation in the industry, and I'm sure Carmela will tell you about the amount of workload that people are, and time that people in ESG roles and kind of legal compliance roles have spent on it over the last year or so. So there are good things and there are not so good things, but one of the other issues as well we've heard recently is that in a way SFDR, and I know we're speaking about the taxonomy, but SFDR itself is actually becoming a bit of a de facto labeling regime almost, and it was never meant to. We're hearing that some LPs are screening out Article 6 funds, and the SFDR regulation is just not really fit for that labeling purpose. It was never meant to be that. So we would say to investors, to remember what it's there for. It's a disclosure regime, not a labeling regime. But then coming to the taxonomy itself, as Antonello mentioned, there are some specific technical issues for PE. Again, I'm sure Carmela can kind of go into a bit more detail here in a moment, but I think generally the regulation's been designed as a one-size-fits-all type regulation in terms of asset classes. So there are certain parts of it that private equity investors find really challenging to actually comply with. For example, certain or Article 8 and 9 funds actually require some pre-contractual disclosure of the anticipated alignment percentage with the taxonomy. So that's, before they've even made their first investment. So obviously these are blind pool vehicles, and investors don't know how those portfolios, those funds are going to ultimately be constructed. So, it's really difficult for GPs to put a number on, the percentage expected alignment with the taxonomy. So there are specific PE challenges as well as the usual kind of data challenges in private markets. That's always a hurdle. Just for example, unlike in public markets, most private companies at entry, when a GP kind of makes an investment, probably most often don't have carbon footprinting even in place. Kind of anecdotally, people tell me about around 80 or 90% of those kind of, especially mid-market companies, don't even have that data. And again, as Antonello mentioned, there are kind of regulatory developments in the EU that will hopefully help that. So, as you said, the new CSRD corporate disclosure requirements should help. Unfortunately, again, there's a bit of a mismatch in the timing of those. Not that the CSRD ideally should have come first to put the data that GPs, private equity firms need in their hands, and the corporates to actually have that data to assess them against the taxonomy. But the taxonomy kind of regulation, it kind of comes into play a little bit before the CSRD does. When you mentioned gas and nuclear, look, I'm sure everyone's seen recently that it was decided to include investments in the taxonomy associated with gas and nuclear power, which, despite the issues with both forms of energy, both are therefore kind of now deemed as sustainable investments, albeit, but there are a number of kind of guardrails around that, certain additional criteria that have to be met for gas and nuclear to be investments to be aligned with the taxonomy, but still it kind of, they can clearly play a role in an energy transition, but should they be labeled as sustainable? PRI believes that shouldn't really be the case, but look, of course, the inclusion of those two sources of energy was always going to be like a super political issue, and I think with what's happened over the last couple of weeks, with the invasion of Ukraine, I think that's changed everything, and particularly around energy security for Europe. So the inclusion of gas and nuclear still has to go through the European Council and Parliament, given the changes and kind of Europe's desire or need to try to wean itself off of Russian gas. Maybe it will kind of have a more difficult route through the council or parliament. So I guess we'll have to wait and see on that.
Yeah, and the situation in Ukraine, obviously, difficult to ignore, impossible to ignore, is going to have a huge effect on the ESG space in general as well, I expect. I mean, Carmela, you're seeing this from a sort of the ground level in terms of being a representative of a private equity firm. What are we observing in the space, and how are firms like yours adapting?
Thanks for that. I think Peter hit the nail in the head when he called it suboptimal from an implementation perspective. So what we're seeing, even taking a step back, you can speak to as many advisors as you like, and everyone has a different interpretation of this Article 8, Article 9, and what the requirements are. So I was super convinced that we needed to report on taxonomy alignment for Article 8 and 9. And then someone told me, no, you don't need that. Just last week, and it just changes things every day. Or these principal adverse indicators, these KPIs that also should be reported by Article 8 and 9 funds. Just recently, some people I started saying, well, they actually need to be reported quarterly instead of annually, right? And as Peter mentioned, in the private market space, most of the times when we buy a company, these companies haven't done much on sustainability, or if they have, it hasn't been done with the level of formality that you would expect, or that the regulator would expect, right? So there's a period in time where you need to teach them how to collect all the data that is needed, and this will apply to the taxonomy as well, right? And coach them and make them own it, because this is not only relevant to us, but it's also relevant to their lenders, is relevant to the next owner. So you need to build a culture, and that's the case always in ESG, but even more with this data profile, you need to get the CFOs involved. Because of CSRD, the companies will have to get assurance, right? So it's basically going to be a really steep curve for a lot of companies, especially in the mid-market space, to be able to gather this data and get it to a quality that is good enough to go through the processes that the EU has defined, right? So I think that's we're spending a lot of time in that. We're also spending, a lot of time modifying our fund documentation, speaking with advisors, getting the systems in place to gather this data and be able to report it to clients. But I said in the beginning, I'm an engineer, and I joined Partners Group because I was going to use my knowledge to change companies from an operational perspective and have an impact. And this is what my mandate is, really, to change the way that companies do businesses, right? But every time I start talking about what I do and they ask me about my objectives for this year, I actually start with data, which should be really the outcome of an ESG journey that the companies go through, and a transformational process, right? But But I guess, it's fine. It will help the overall industry, but it's just a bit complicated, I would say, to implement, and maybe not as focused in impact as we would hope for.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting point. You starting with the data, and it's really hard, isn't it? I mean, trying to sort of get consistency in reporting, get consistent information. It's a very difficult data set to pin down. I mean, Carmela, staying with you, you've mentioned the challenges. Can you share more about those challenges, faced in assembling, collecting ESG data from managers and their underlying companies, from their portfolio companies, and as well as at the same time trying to navigate that really complex web of ESG regulations and different reporting frameworks?
Yeah, it's definitely. I mean, I can share the Partners Group experience, and build from that. We actually started sending a survey in 2015 to our portfolio companies, right? But in these years, the questionnaire has grown, it has evolved, and last year when the SFDR PAIs came out and the EU Taxonomy came out, we started, we integrated those KPIs as well, right? We also started mapping our investments against the NACI codes, which is the industry classification that the EU has selected. And we thought that was going to be a simple VLOOKUP between whatever classification system our investment teams use and NACI, and we just needed to convert it, and then that was it, right? But the NACI code's level of detail is totally different from any other industry classification, so that already poses a big problem, because for the straightforward investments, renewable energy and so on, it's relatively easy, but everything else requires a lot of manual work. And for a manager that has not only direct investments but also fund-of-fund investments, this will, it's just being an additional challenge that we were not expecting, just to be able to assess eligibility, right? So that's, for instance, one particular challenge that we're facing, and that I'm discussing with my colleagues in other funds, and everyone seems to be facing the same. That it's not only the data that we collect from the companies, and this lack of maturity that I mentioned in the beginning, but actually, also more structural topics that are just inherent to the way that things were defined, and this need that I think it was also Peter that mentioned, it's a bit of a one size fits all kind of approach, and private markets companies or targets are just different types of companies. Our way of investing is different. When we buy a company, on the direct side, it's like a marriage, right? I mean, well, it kind of has an expiration date. Hopefully not every marriage does, but still it's a really long-term relationship, and you're kind of stuck with your assets. And what are you going to do if the EU decides that your asset is no longer sustainable? We are facing, rules that were set not necessarily for our industry, and that are expected to change. And in that sense, they also didn't consider an industry that invests in the really long term. So and as I said, they're assuming in a lot of ways that we need to apply these filters based on KPIs or eligibility, which I think is great for our clients in the end, but they're not taking into consideration the active ownership approach that one could have in private equity, and the positive influence that you can have in the fate of these companies, right? So if a company is not eligible today, ideally, I spend my time working with them, making sure that they are eligible by the time I exit them, right? So I think that's another challenge, another thing that was not necessarily taken into consideration.
Thank you. That's really interesting. And Peter, I mean, from your seat, how close are we to that sort of common language, and are we seeing an evolving solution just to get around that reporting complexity? I mean, the UNPRI are at the center of that. So, how are you guys helping, and what are you guys seeing?
I mean, look, I think we're a little way off. And again, look, I guess I don't want to be too negative persistently, because I do think this is, we're heading in the right direction, and this will be a great tool and a great kind of mechanism of channeling capital into the right kind of areas of the economy. But I think we're still quite a long way off of that kind of common language across the whole thing. Because if you remember what Antonello said at the beginning, this is the environmental taxonomy, and the technical screening criteria only cover one of those kind of six, one of the six aspects of that taxonomy so far. We're also kind of just entering into discussions around the potential social taxonomy. So in terms of taxonomies, quite a long way off a common language, I think. And there are also other countries, China, among others, that have also established or establishing their own green taxonomies in certain places. So we could have competing alternative classification schemes on a global basis as well. So we're a little way off, but it's tough to get to that sort of common language, but I think it's a worthwhile goal. And I guess everyone, including the PRI, is trying to pull all the levers and work with all the various initiatives and parties involved to try to collaborate together to make that happen, really.
Thanks, Peter. And just in terms of the regulators, I mean, obviously we're talking today primarily about what's going on within the EU, but you mentioned other parts of the world. I mean, what's the connectivity like? Are they talking to each other about standardization, or are they just going to go their own different ways? Which obviously, it wouldn't be unusual. That's how global regulators tend to work. We have lots of competing and overlapping standards in other areas.
Is that back to me, Gwyn?
Sorry, Peter.
I have a first kind of crack at it, I guess. I think I think you're right. I think that that they're working to their own agendas to an extent. I mean, you've got organisations like the PRI. We have I think it must be a 20-person policy team now, based in all different parts of the world, from the US, UK, Europe, China, who interact with the regulators on exactly these kind of topics. So you've got the PRI and others that try to impress upon regulators, I suppose, a need for harmonisation, and then other industry bodies, Invest Europe, the BVCA, they all do a lot of good policy work as well. So for investors that want to, or signatories that want to kind of get involved in those kind of things, we're always working on consultations, responses to all the regulations that kind of work their way through the pipeline. The PRI or any of those industry bodies is one way of doing that.
Great, thank you, Peter. And I want to talk a little bit about the next steps. Actually, we've spoken about how we're dealing with the current issues, about the potential, because there is huge potential to get this right, but also some of the problems that besets the space, and also just the struggles to achieve uniformity. But in terms of the next steps with EU taxonomy, I mean, Carmela, what should private fund managers be doing now to get ready for the next developments, and how are you guys preparing for it, and what are you guys doing?
Yeah, well, so we are taking as things as they are right now. So we are getting all our funds aligned with what an Article 8 fund would expect, and then if depending on how the taxonomy evolves, we may review this categorization and upgrade to Article 9 if needed. But we are taking the approach of saying, well, we need to make sure that our sustainability commitments, the ones that we made, since we started implementing sustainability, are actually honored. So really taking it to that level, but being cautious in the sense of not making assumptions around the taxonomy that could, potentially eventually get us accused of greenwashing or anything of the sort, right? But I mean, we hope that in the long run, these additional, additional requirements for being able to make claims around sustainability actually lead to a more transparent industry, and to better decision making from our clients, right? But I would say, yeah, we're taking the taxonomy as it is, trying to build our systems, working extensively with our IT team to build the back end so that we can capture the data and then report it. And as I said, just working with the assets so that they are ready, and that whatever they set up, it's flexible enough to adapt over time. and also making sure that they understand that it's not us, that there's a bigger force pushing for this, because sometimes, especially for non-EU investments, it can be hard to understand why they need to do it. So making sure that they see the bigger picture.
Yeah, I'm guessing, Carmela, there's a certain amount of education that needs to be done as well, because not everybody gets this. Whether you're a GP or an LP, depending on where you are in the world, it's tricky, isn't it? It's tricky to get your arms around.
Yeah, definitely. But I think in that sense, what is helping is that ESG has moved from being a nice to have or something that, only certain managers did, to something that pretty much everyone has to address. So even for, let's take an asset in the US or in Asia, if they want to have an exit that, contemplates potential buyers that are in Europe, they will have to address these topics, right? Or if they want to get listed, they may have exposure. So basically, to your point, yeah, we need to do education, but I think the evolution of ESG also helps in that regard. It's just that maybe the word hasn't made it to all corners of the world yet.
Yeah, and I suppose in our space, nothing focuses your mind like a successful exit. So if that's what it's going to take, that's what it's going to take. Antonello, from your perspective, you're seeing a lot of this in aggregate, given the amounts of clients that the Intertrust Group has. In terms of the next steps in implementation, how are you helping, be it technology or anything else that you're guiding clients with?
Sure. So first, I think as Peter mentioned, I think that there's still quite a long way to go there from a regulatory perspective. So the technical screening criteria have been established for 2 of the 6 objectives, so climate change mitigation and adaptation, and are expected for the remainder of the year for the 4 additional. So that's still a little bit of I would say regulatory framework to be created to really make sure that there is a good alignment to taxonomy. And then there is the also initiative from the platforms of sustainable finance. They have recently provided their recommendation on social taxonomy. And as well, Peter mentioned that in the coming years, we'll probably see then an extension also in the scope of taxonomy. At the same time, the EU looks at capitalizing on all this work that is being done. So we will also see over time that taxonomy will be used for different type of products. So, for example, on social bond standard or eco labels, they probably have to report according to taxonomy. So I'd say we're probably still really at the beginning of the regulatory and compliance journey there, and we are there to support our clients through that journey.
Great, thank you. And we haven't got a huge amount of time left, so it might be worth getting some closing thoughts from everybody, starting with Peter.
Yeah, sure. Look, I guess these developments aren't always easy to follow, kind of like to the casual observer or anyone else. So I would say take a look at the PRI website from time to time. That's unpri.org. We regularly kind of put out investor briefings around SFDR and taxonomy, quite detailed ones actually. So they're pretty good from our policy team. So take a look at those. We also, it was a couple of years ago now, organised what we called our taxonomy practitioners group, where we had investors both EU and non-EU based, who shared tools and experiences among that group to help try to understand and overcome, some of the barriers to implementation that we've been talking about today. And we published a report that summarized the findings of, I think it was around 35 case studies from different signatories into, the way they use the taxonomy or planning to use the taxonomy. And you can find all of those on the website too. And we're working on a follow-up to that report at the moment, which I think it's due sometime this month actually. So keep an eye out for sort of a refreshed version of that. But we try to kind of provide resources and to help signatories and, well, anyone actually kind of keep up to date with these issues.
Great, thank you, Peter. And Carmela, I mean, what does the future hold in store for you guys at Partners Group?
Well, I mean, I think, we're going to keep implementing this and keeping an eye on regulation and using resources from UNPRI and other industry associations. But I think if anyone from the EU is listening or watching, I would just ask, that, as the taxonomy is flexible and it will evolve over time, hopefully the specifics of different asset classes will be taken into consideration. So, we're happy and welcoming to have it, but just, let's try to make sure that it accounts for what we do. And I would ask for this consistency, right? Also, not only to the EU, but any other regulator. For the EU, to have SFDR and CSRD being consistent, that would be a great help. But then also for, other regulators that are looking into this, the SEC and so on, just making sure that whatever they do, makes sense and hopefully helps evolve it make us evolve as an industry, rather than generate an additional burden, because everyone is talking about collecting this data, but no one is talking about what we're going to do with it, besides from reporting once we get it. So, I am happy to have the data, but I would like to get into, analytics, getting things done with the companies so that we can improve and not just report.
Yeah, that's a massively important point, isn't it? That we have a huge amount of data, but what do we do with it? The analytics, it's so important, and it applies to so many parts of our space as well, not just ESG. And Antonello, given that hopefully a few EU commissioners are watching this, what would be your final message and your final thoughts?
Well, I think again, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of alignment of standards. And what we see is also that our clients and also their LPs are looking to get data more and more on a frequent basis. So I think there needs to be close collaboration, not only between regulators, but also between regulators and industry associations, to identify that possibly, ideally, global standard for the collection of ESG data. I think we are far away from that, but at the same time, I also think that taxonomy helps to go in that direction. So I'm optimistic there. I also think that we will see companies is becoming more and more evident that we'll have to embrace sustainability. We'll have to embrace ESG if they want to remain relevant over time. So I think that's quite clear there, and both regulators and industry associations are moving in the right direction there together with the market. So I'm optimistic.
Thank you. And clearly, there's a huge amount of willingness. There is a coalition of the willing who want to make this work. We just need a bit more clarity. And with organisations like the UNPRI, with your solutions at Intertrust and people like Carmela at the Partners Group who are sort of driving this internally at private markets firms, we will get there. It is just going to take some time. Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. I want to thank the Intertrust Group for hosting us all. It's been a really good conversation. Thank you to Peter, thank you to Carmela, thank you to Antonello. And if anybody who's watching today or in the future has any questions, please do get in touch. We'll be happy to help. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Gwen. Thank you.